Welcome to EVA India Insights, the podcast exploring ideas shaping India's business landscape. I'm your host Pallavi, and today we're diving into how automotive companies can diversify and unlock new revenue opportunities. Joining us is Som Kapoor, automotive and future of mobility leader and consulting partner at EVA India. With over 2 decades of industry experience, Som shares practical perspectives on expanding beyond traditional models and tapping into new mobility ecosystems. In this episode, we discuss why diversification is essential, the emerging revenue streams in mobility, electrification, services, and digital, and and the strategic roadmap needed to capture these opportunities, along with the risks that leaders must navigate. So let's dive in. A very warm welcome to you, Som, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Pallavi. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to you. And hi, everybody, to whoever gets an opportunity to hear us on this podcast. This podcast is special to me because it's one of the first podcasts I'm doing. But beyond that, it is also part of a thought leadership we had come out with some time back. So a lot of what I'm saying is if you want details of what is available at EY, happy to get in touch with you and share the thought leadership with you, which will give you a lot more on what we have after this podcast.
Thank you, Som. Uh, to begin with, India's auto component industry has seen diversified players outperform specialists in recent years. So, what are the key factors driving this trend, and how is diversification reshaping competitiveness in this sector?
Good question, Palvi. But essentially, for some companies, outperforming means higher growth. For some, it means higher profitability. For others, especially who are in a cyclical market as automotive, outperforming could mean greater stability, fewer crests, fewer troughs. More resilient earnings for some companies. So, diversification is not just about one particular metric that you can manage. So diversification enables different kinds of performance. Some people do it for growth, some people do it for stability. It depends on the dimension which is required. Interestingly, the research that I was talking about, during our research, we figured out that all the firms that were diversified, they all showed a higher net profit margin. So 6% net profit margin for the diversified versus 5.5% for the specialist firms. Another interesting fact that actually came out was all the diversified firms show lower volatility in ROCE. So, diversified firms were at 0.56% versus specialist firms, which were at 0.73%. So, both from a ROCE perspective and from a net profit margin perspective, we saw diversified firms doing better. One other very interesting fact we noticed was that if you don't want to go back, but if you go back to the COVID period, the specialist firms saw a very sharp decline in profitability. They were, it was nearly double, right? 1% decline in profitability for diversified firms versus 2% for, very firms which were particular in a business product. And if you look at ROCE, the ROCE was 6% for diversified versus 10% drop for non-diversified firms. So, both from a ROCE and a net profit margins perspective, we figured out that diversified firms tend to do better. Interestingly, we thought that, scale and size, we wanted to see the impact of that. If you actually look at large specialist firms, they have a slightly weaker performance compared to large diversified peers. So diversification, even with scale, leads to benefits. Some of the key reasons why diversified firms are probably doing slightly better. Technology transition, they've been getting to more EV, NEV, single powertrain versus multiple powertrain. They can reallocate capabilities to new platforms. They manage geopolitical and supply chain fragility slightly better. I mean, we're living in the world of tariffs, rare earth supply restrictions, etc. So all of that helps diversified firms rather than specialist firms. Diversification, reduces exposure to single markets or materials. A lot of the OEMs for their vendor consolidation. An OEM also wants to work with integrated multi-domain solution providers rather than very specialist firms. So that actually helps diversified firms. And customer concentration risk. Diversified firms tap multiple customer segments and channels. It helps. They reduce vulnerability compared to specialist firms. So all of that put together actually helps diversified firms more than specialist firms to that extent.
So, moving on to the next question, what forms of diversification are proving the most effective today, such as the capability expansion, entry into new mobility platforms like EVs and hybrids, global market presence, or moving into new adjacent industries?
Okay. That's very, very interesting again, but the way we looked at diversification, when we were thinking about this whole concept of diversification, etc., we figured out that most people tend to do diversification for two primary objectives. Does it help us in growth, or does it help us in in stability of business? We realized that capability and powertrain were the two areas which are going to help people in growth. Capability from a variety of technical competencies, powertrain, because I mean, we're living in a multi-powertrain world: ICE, CNG, EV, PHEV, hydrogen in the future, etc. So those two will help people in growth, pure play from a growth perspective. And then, stability was the other lens that we looked towards for diversification. And there were three elements that we thought that came out of stability. Geography. I mean, the more you can reduce dependency on any one country or region. I mean, we're living in the tariff world, right? You'd understand what I'm talking about. So
Yes.
geography, industry, applying competencies outside of automotive. If you can work with industries, agencies to automotive, it actually helps. And customer oblique channel was adding multiple customers a channel that helps in stability. So just to recap that, growth came from capability and powertrain, and stability came in from geography, industry, oblique customer and channel. So that's the lens we applied towards diversification. But let me just qualify one thing. They're not mutually exclusive. So most companies will tend to use a combination. So it is the way we looked at it was there are these five kinds of diversification, but they're not mutually exclusive to it. It's not a MESI. They actually, most companies will apply more than one lens to the way when they're looking at diversification. So, I mean, let me give you an example. So, growth-oriented diversification. So, when I talk about capability diversification, it's revenue growth across all dimensions, right? You get into EV components, electronics, software, if that works for you. When you look at powertrain, powertrain will become a very important. So, can you do ICE versus hybrid versus NEV to spread your volume risk, etc. And those are the kind of things that will help growth. And from a stability perspective, currently we're in a geographical diversification is very, very important. Demand cycles are different, tariffs, regulatory shifts. So geographical diversification for a country like India is extremely, extremely important because we haven't really looked beyond our traditional one or two, three big countries that we export to for most companies. So we need to figure out what are the new set of companies, upcoming companies where we can go and diversify into. I also spoke about industry diversification, competencies outside of automotive. What are we doing towards rail, defense, construction equipment, tractors? So it's more about stability than breakout growth. But the minute you can diversify into defense, just as an example, is something which is a very keen interest to India as such, and that will help us. And finally, customer channel diversification. I mean, how can you reduce your over reliance on one or two OEMs? Can you have a lower revenue variation? It helps predictability of business. All of that put together, if you can work towards a channel diversification plan for yourself, you'll tend to do better. So those were a few lenses that we applied to when we thought of diversification for automotive component players and automotive companies in India.
Adding on to that, as about the diversification, as companies diversify, what are the main operational governance or cultural challenges they face, and how can leadership build the right structures to manage this complexity so effectively?
Well, the three challenges I just heard are a few operational, governance, and cultural. For operational, there are two or three big things that come across. One is coordination across engineering, sourcing, manufacturing, sales, because you have new businesses come up, especially managing different product lines, platforms, geographies. So those are the kind of challenges I can foresee when you look at operational challenges. You could probably end up having different digital systems, CRM, ERP, which come in from different businesses. You'll be adding more SKUs to your business, new testing cycles, supplier ecosystems. So those are typically the kind of operational challenges that you'll end up facing. Governance, I think it's all about capital allocation to my mind. If there's going to be ambiguity towards capital allocation between core and new businesses, you'll always have challenges of governance. So you should be very clear about ambiguity of you should be clear about capital allocation over there. The second big governance challenge I have seen when it comes down to companies which have diversified is how do they expand their leadership and especially the mid management teams to keep track of diversification initiatives. And what is also happening is a lot of these diversification initiatives tend to become siloed projects instead of integrated strategies. So how do you make sure that they're not siloed projects but part of your integrated business strategy? So those are the three aspects on governance. And cultural, well, it's all about legacy teams versus new teams. That basically requires more professional bandwidth. How do you integrate those new capabilities with legacy teams? That's what comes to my mind every time you talk about diversification. The other thing is, sometimes you're going to be challenged with, you could probably have entrepreneurial energy in some units versus some of the old mature units will be old style businesses. So how do you manage that entrepreneurial energy with those mature units? That's something that comes to my mind from a cultural perspective. And one of the other elements when you diversify and you actually move to become a systems or a solution mindset rather than a single component player. So how do you think differently to say, I'm not just a component player, but I'm providing a system or a solution to the market now? So how do you deal with the OEMs with that thought in your mind? So I think the way to solve for this is you need a cross disciplinary collaboration. You need to have a one company culture even if you've diversified into different businesses. How do you figure out that one company culture is the single most important thing to my mind when it comes down to diversification? And you can do all of that, but you need to treat diversification as a test learn scale. It probably you pilot your new capabilities before committing large capex so that you've tested to a great extent, you learn from there, and then to scale you decide you want to use a joint venture, technical collaboration, a small acquisition to de-risk early entry. Which of those three works for you the most? So that is something that I've kind of learned with companies that have successfully diversified over the last few years. We've helped quite a few companies diversify, and I think this whole test, learn, scale approach that we've kind of built in has really helped companies over a period of time.
Thank you, Som. So, how do partnerships, acquisitions, and talent redeployment play a role in accelerating successful diversification and technology transformation journeys?
Well, simply put, partnerships will give you access to new technologies that would take you years to build internally. I mean, that's the key element why somebody would want to get into a partnership early up. Your tech collaborations can help companies validate an industry before you decide to invest at scale. You test before you scale. So partnerships can actually help you do all of that. Acquisition on the other end, if speed to market is critical. Lots of businesses here are built on who has the first approach, who has the first time right approach, and an acquisition from that perspective is absolutely great. It'll accelerate your capability expansion. Any place where speed to market is critical. You acquire ready-made talent, you get the intellectual property along with it, you get the certification frameworks along with it. So an acquisition will help you do all of that. Uh, when you look at talent redeployment, well, to my mind, maintaining cultural continuity and process discipline across all the new capabilities, because it comes down to a simple fact that businesses are run by people. right? And if you don't have the right set of people maintaining the legacy that you've built over such a long period of time, just to acquire, get into a new score of business, you don't want to be in a position wherein your old legacy businesses start to take the impact of that. And that is something that is happening quite significantly at some of the places where we've seen diversification has not worked. And if you were to ask me, give me one reason why some of these diversification policies haven't worked, and I'd just say cultural continuity and discipline across the new capabilities didn't fit in with the old business. So those are some examples that come to my mind. When you say that, how do partnerships, acquisitions, talent redeployment play a role for successfully diversifying? Those three are probably the three or four most critical things you need to do from a successful business deployment perspective.
Thank you so much. For component manufacturers still heavily specialized, what initial steps would you recommend to start diversifying at the same time to safeguard their own strengths and profitability?
I wish I could give you an answer that would fit all, but unfortunately, I don't have that answer. This diversification thought process doesn't fit all. It has to be uniquely tailored to every firm situation. It depends on, for every player, it depends on the financial strength they get onto the table, the customer concentration do they have, the exposure to technology. What is your dependence on one powertrain to that extent? What is market geography risk? What is your ambition? Actually, that would probably be, what's your firm-wide ambition? And what are you doing this for? For those five things, it depends on these five things, but what are you diversifying for? Are you diversifying for growth, or are you diversifying for hedging risk? Those are the kind of dimensions. You would probably end up making a two by two out of those, and then come up with, say, is, man, I'm diversifying for growth. Then I'd probably say, you need to look at capability or powertrain, etc., and start with that thought process. But everything that you do, the one thing that I've learned in my limited experience of diversifying with a bunch of companies is, you need to figure out your boundary conditions. Is my boundary condition top line growth of 20%, etc.? What is it that I can take it up to? Do I want break even in 3 years, 5 years? What is the capex I'm willing to go ahead with? Once you have those boundary conditions clearly identified, that's when you should think about, okay, with these boundary conditions, am I looking at growth? Am I looking at stability? If I'm looking at growth, what is the financial strength I have? What is the customer concentration that I have? So those are the kind of lenses that you would look at putting out for a successful set of diversified activities. So build your boundary conditions very, very well upfront before you start with this business.
And lastly, looking ahead, how do you see Indian auto component players evolving from being traditional suppliers to becoming integrated system or solution partners in global mobility ecosystem?
Diversification is not rare. Uh, it is now a lot more common. It's not rare at all. Lots of Indian suppliers are diversifying. They are using that lens of capability, powertrain, geography. I think, to be very honest with you, to give it a little bit of a national fervor, I'd say it's our time in the sun. And for the Indian component industry to actually become globally world challenging, diversification is one of the thoughts that needs to be spread far and wide now. And I think that diversification is already starting to happen. We're seeing a bunch of these Indian component players trying to become system solution roles providers. We're seeing lots of people get into technology transitions. EVs, hybrids, electronics, thermal systems. They're not standalone parts. These people are starting to build integrated solutions over there. Capability diversification. Mechanical plus electronic plus embedded systems. All of that put together naturally moves from towards system integration. So we are seeing system integration. We are seeing people move into integrated solutions. So we're already seeing some of that. Even from an OEM perspective, right? An OEM would prefer to work with fewer suppliers who can do multi-domain, multi-platform competencies, because it helps them also. It helps them in their buying process. So diversified suppliers fit this model. They deliver broader subsystems. They collaborate earlier in the design cycles. So an OEM really appreciates this because in this scenario, people will help them in their collaborate earlier in the design cycle, which an OEM already appreciates. Capability diversification as a foundation is something that is coming out quite effectively because you start using global platforms. This is a key requirement for becoming a solutions partner. So capability diversification is becoming a good foundation for some of the Indian OEMs. You're getting new customers, so I mean, think of it that aftermarket, digital, D2C channels, they are kind of becoming new customers for them. And rather than being just a product supplier, you're becoming a service enabled solution provider. And we are seeing all of this happen, people diversifying only to get into a new customer channel perspective. Mobility ecosystem becoming platform led. I mean, you could probably figure out that there are lots of adjacent technologies today, and they will form the backbone for some of these integrated digital ecosystems. So that is help. We're seeing some of the Indian OESs go down that way. But before I close this out, I just have uh, a lot of these companies who are wanting to diversify need to do four things. They need to manage their diversification intentionally. It should be capability led and not just opportunistic, which was the case till maybe a few years back. It has to be capability led. They need to invest in cross functional talent and governance systems, build digital and software link capabilities, and obviously leverage collaboration, acquisition, internal talent redeployment to scale these new verticals so that they can keep the whole cultural angle in place. So those would be my last few words on where I believe a lot of these companies are moving towards doing diversification. And kudos to some of the companies that have done it very well. But I look forward to a lot more Indian companies actually scaling through diversification to make sure we get our fair share in the sun for the Indian automotive industry going forward. So Pallavi, that those would probably be the few thoughts I had on diversification for the Indian auto sector.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this episode. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights and strategic thinking and your real world experience with us today to our listeners.
Thank you, Pallavi. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And to all our listeners, if you're in the automotive or mobility space, I hope this conversation gives you fresh ideas to explore and inspires you to chart your own path into new revenue horizons. If you've enjoyed this episode of EY India Insights, please subscribe and share it with your network. Stay connected with us. Until next time, this is Pallavi signing off.